It's a chilly night in 2006. Brian Shaffer is a medical student on spring break. He is seen walking into this bar with two friends. As time went by, the bar closed and everyone could be seen leaving the bar. Everyone except one man, Brian Shaffer. When the bar closed at 2 a.m, his two friends stood outside the bar and tried to call his phone. No response. The two friends assumed Brian went home sometime earlier that night, so they headed home themselves. Brian was not seen leaving the bar on the camera covering the exit. This is the story of Brian Shaffer, a disappearance so baffling it defies all logic and leaves us with more questions than answers. Brian is a second-year medical student studying at Ohio State University. It was there he met his girlfriend of 9 months, Alexis Wagner, a fellow med student. The couple had promising careers ahead and planned a trip to Miami in the following weeks to come. Brian often expressed his thoughts and opinions on his MySpace biography. "I have an awesome and amazing girlfriend. She's super hot and lots of fun." A month before his disappearance, Brian faced the devastating loss of his mother, Renee, to cancer. Brian was extremely close with his mother, describing her on his MySpace as the greatest, most wonderful person in the world. Renee's passing deeply affected Brian, and in the following weeks, in March, Brian would ask Alexis if she would run away with him. This is an oddly suspicious thing to say for someone who would disappear into thin air weeks later. But this could have been a joke or an exaggerated reaction. However, the next thing Alexis recalls is even more concerning. "You should move on with your life and find someone else, as I am having a difficult time dealing with my mother's death." If Brian was joking or not, we will never know, as a week later, Brian Shaffer was never seen again. Friday, March 31st, 2006 was the start of spring break. After losing his mother and the pressure of studying for his finals, Brian Shaffer desperately needed this break. His trip to Miami with his girlfriend was just 3 days away, and it was thought to be where Brian would propose to Alexis. The next few weeks of his life were going to be a life-changing experience, but not for the reasons anyone could have imagined. On the evening of Friday, 31st of March, Brian met up with his father for a steak dinner. His father reported Brian seemed tired and suggested to Brian to get an early night. However, Brian had already made plans to go out that night with a good friend, Clint Florence. After dinner, Brian and Clint met up at the Ugly Tuna Saloon located in Columbus, Ohio. An hour later, at around 10 p.m, Brian made his last call with his girlfriend to wish her a good night. According to Alexis, Brian sounded completely normal, nothing for her to worry about. After having shot some beers at the Ugly Tuna Saloon, Brian and Clint wandered through the neighbourhood. Clint reported they had stopped by multiple bars, each ordering a shot of liquor at each stop. At around midnight, the pair met up with Clint's friend, Meredith Reed, who offered to drive them back to the Ugly Tuna Saloon for a final round of drinks. Security footage outside the bar shows the three riding an escalator to the bar's entrance at 1:15 a.m. 40 minutes later, at 1:55 a.m, Brian and Clint were seen outside the bar talking to two women. Whilst Clint and the other women were talking, Brian spoke to Brighton Zacco. She reported Brian being flirtatious with her and that the two even exchanged numbers. Although unethical, Brian so far has shown no signs of wanting to disappear or any sense of unusual behaviour. 2 minutes later, Brian can be seen moving off camera back towards the direction of the bar entrance. This would be the last time Brian was seen on camera. When the bar closed at 2 a.m, Clint and Meredith waited outside the bar where Brian was nowhere to be seen. They tried calling him several times, however, all his calls went to voicemail. The two didn't think much of it and figured Brian went home sometime earlier that night. Throughout the weekend, calls from his father and his girlfriend went unanswered, and on Monday morning, Brian missed his flight to Miami, sparking a missing persons investigation.
So let's go back to Monday, April 3rd, 2006, when the police report was filed. Tell me what you, as the lead detective, started doing.
Well, once the report come in, the initial officer started looking at the homeless shelters, hospitals, the typical places that you would look for somebody that may have gone missing.
After realising that this was no ordinary missing persons investigation, detectives went over security footage. Looking at the security footage of what we do have of Brian, he was seen at 1:15 a.m. going up an escalator, entering the bar. The next time Brian appears was 42 minutes later at 1:57 a.m. after Brian and Clint go outside to talk to two girls. Brian is seen going back towards the bar. This is the last movement we have of Brian. Detectives remained uncertain whether Brian disappeared on his own accord or if someone else was involved. But this still doesn't explain why nobody in the building or the numerous security cameras didn't notice him leaving the bar. Investigators next analysed every possible way Brian could have left the building, starting off with the construction site. Behind the camera's view, there were two doors which led to a construction site. Investigators wondered if Brian exited the bar through the construction site. Some even wondered if Brian fell into cement. However, investigators believed that this was not the case.
There's just no way Brian was left anywhere in that building. I mean, it was searched with a fine-tooth comb. We had the cadaver dogs come in and go through that building. And, had he been in there, even if he was covered up with dirt, they would have hit on it and picked up on it.
There was another possible exit through the fire escape, which was located near the front entrance. After investigators interviewed the manager of the Ugly Tuna Saloon, it was confirmed nobody had gone through the fire escape linked to the bar. As well as this, investigators checked cameras surrounding the courtyard where Brian was nowhere to be seen. Another way Brian could have escaped was by jumping off the balcony of the Ugly Tuna Saloon. Although not a very credible source, a Redditor recalled drunk people jumping off that balcony. However, when interviewing people at the bar, no one witnessed such an occurrence. Jumping off a bar without anyone noticing whilst drunk was just too unlikely. How Brian left the bar was still one question in itself. However, it still doesn't explain what happened afterwards. How did Brian just vanish into thin air? Brian's phone didn't have GPS, so investigators couldn't locate where it was. 7 months after Brian was declared missing, investigators managed to ping signals from a cell tower about 14 miles northwest of Columbus. However, the cellular company claims it was a glitch. In an interview with the lead detective, John Hurst, he mentions they pinged his phone numerous times located near the Ugly Tuna Saloon.
And we did get a couple pings back then, a couple areas that we checked. One was out on the west side. We went out there and checked an area, and then one that was another one down on, I believe it was Kinney Road, and around Lane Avenue. Detective Edwards and myself went down and we checked that area to see if we could locate anything that would be useful in the investigations.
This meant two things. Brian did indeed leave the building. Secondly, his phone was on for days after the investigation, which leads us to the sole question. If his phone was on, why did Brian ignore his family's phone calls? Or why did he not contact the police if he was in danger? Many theories and speculation surround what might have happened to Brian Shaffer, but none provide a definitive answer. Let's start with the most obvious theory, which many people believe. Brian Shaffer was simply at the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe he bumped into someone or said something to the wrong person, or perhaps he talked to someone's girlfriend. Brighton? Could she have had a boyfriend who was responsible for Brian's disappearance? Some people also believe that Brian's friend, Clint Florence, might have been involved in his disappearance since he refused to take a lie detector test during the investigation. Although I don't find this particularly suspicious. Lie detector tests can be extremely unreliable and could cause Clint trouble, especially if they're inaccurate. But as I was researching more about this case, a more interesting theory caught my eye. It was alleged Clint fancied Meredith, and Meredith fancied Brian. Perhaps some sort of jealousy was involved. There is also the possibility that Brian intentionally disappeared, wanting to escape after his mother's passing, although many close family and friends insist that he wouldn't do that. We can't be for sure what he might have been planning. This could have been possible if Brian had a change of clothes to disguise himself well enough to evade detection by the cameras. However, when investigators reviewed the footage, they managed to identify everyone who left the bar that night. Brian was not showing any signs of unusual behaviour either. Someone who wanted to disappear without a trace would likely be looking into the cameras and looking for the blind spots. Yet Brian not once looked or acknowledged them. There is a possibility that Brian wasn't seen leaving the bar because he was in the blind spot of the security camera. If we know he didn't stay inside the bar, he must have left somehow, which leads us to our next theory. Just outside the Ugly Tuna Saloona was a service exit that led to a construction site. The theory I've settled with is that Brian must have escaped through the construction site. Whilst outside, he was met with foul play. Perhaps a fight breaks out or a robbery gone wrong. Thanks so much for the small percentage of you still watching till the end. If you'd like to support me, please consider subscribing. Some of my videos, like my next one, are getting age restricted and demonetized. These videos can take me weeks to make, and I'd be forever grateful if you could support me on my Patreon. There, I'll show you more behind the scenes and interact with you guys. Also, I would love to know what you thought happened to Brian, so comment down below and I'll give them a read.